Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Welcome to the Transitions webinar series. Very briefly, just want to talk about the concept of the transitions. It was born out of a need to provide real, tangible, actionable feedback relative to this very important issue that we're going to touch on regarding how our industry addresses the so-called silver tsunami, the talent gap, the existential threat of baby boomers leaving all industries, not just ours, and how they get replaced. The co-founders decided that we wanted to do something, but we didn't want to do anything that was for profit. We didn't want to do anything that had hidden agendas. We wanted to be very transparent. We wanted to have it be, in fact, there is literally no money involved in the transitions. And the opportunity would not come to fruition without the help of our co-founders, our volunteers, and our sponsors. Cocoa Creative, IAIBC, Rising Medical, North American Risk Services, Amitros, Preferred Medical. Those are just some of the sponsors that are making this work. And I just wanted to thank everybody for all of that. All of the volunteers, all of our speakers in the entire web series, everybody is donating their time for the good of our industry and for the good of this, if you'll allow me to call it such, our movement. In our series of webinars, today is the 7th. It is about reimagining business processes. Specifically, how do we deal with running our various organizations, not only with the generation talent gap that we're going to focus on, but also in a very current way, how do we deal with, in a post-pandemic business environment, how do we address these issues? Today we have 3 amazing speakers who will give you a very different perspective. And we did that purposely. We did not want to focus on one particular segment. We really wanted to give different angles. Our ability to represent diversity, equality, and inclusion is very important to us, and we recognize that as a very critical factor in addressing this so-called talent gap. Going last today, and they will each give their own introduction, but going last today will be Dave North, Executive Chair of Sedgwick, somebody that has ridden the wave of enormous growth and vast change in our industry, and somebody that clearly has a perspective of how to reimagine business. Before him will be Janine Krall, head of risk for one of the largest international famous retailers in Nordstrom, and somebody who chose to be self-insured and self-administered in their workers' comp program and had to deal with not only modifying business processes, but doing it in a way that was consistent with the company's culture. And starting off today will be Shelly Yen, a power broker for sure, somebody who has been in the business when women weren't all that well received, maybe minority women were even less well received, and somebody that has proven to be over many years at the 2 largest brokers in the world, a true power broker, and a very good friend as well. So Shelly, do you want to start us off, please?
Sure, Barry. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Shelly Yen. So I've been on the retail and wholesale brokerage my entire career. So over almost 40 years, I have built up a sizable network of business associates who have become friends, very similar to my relationship with Barry, Dave, and Janine. So over that time, while I'm generally have been known for handling large multinational accounts over the course of my career, developing talent that will push our changing industry forward is something that I've shifted more of my attention to. Since I was fortunate enough to have mentors, coaches, executive sponsors throughout my career who invested in their time in me to help propel my development, I've felt that it's important for me to pay it forward. So when Barry asked me to join this very esteemed group, he wanted to see what my thoughts were on business processes. And it forced me to reflect on how these processes have changed over my career. So starting at a regional brokerage in 1982, manually typing certificates of insurance, auto ID cards and the like on an IBM Selectric, for those of you who remember that, it just seems ridiculous to think about doing that today, given the standards that we have. But yet, when you think about it, a lot of us learned that way. So you fast forward to, how business processes have evolved the last few years. I mean, I'm dealing with, accounting folks in Krakow. Certificates sometimes are produced out of India and other parts of the world. So very different than 39 years ago when I was, a neophyte in this business. So while there've been many improvements, I was thinking of what does that mean for our evolving business model today? So I'm going to segue to reliance on technology versus actual technical knowledge. So I've had the opportunity to work on several global, Fortune 100 technology accounts, which have really changed our lives. I mean, if you think about it, can we live without our mobile device or phone? And I can't imagine life without it, but what if we had to? So for those of you on this webinar who deal with CNA, or if you've worked with CNA, they had a cyber event the last week of March. So right before 4/1 renewals and quarter end. So that forced CNA to go back to their underwriting roots to keep their business moving and to rethink how they're going to keep going. So with that, because they have a very experienced team of some very talented individuals, they were able to bind renewals, even add new business without use of models, files, due to the technical expertise of their experienced underwriters, right? So some of it had to be instinct and that training that they've had over the years. So that incident has forced many of us to revisit our own business continuity plans. What would we do if that happened to us? How would our businesses operate without the internet access? They were down without any access to the internet for 10 days, right before the big renewal date and quarter end. So how are we training some of our less experienced colleagues to function in a manual environment if needed? So while business processes support these required efficiencies, the industry as a whole, I think, really needs to balance that drive for growth and margin. For those of you who work for large publicly traded companies, and even if you work for private companies, those goals, so growth goals and margin, expanding the margin, is something that a lot of us are measured on. But how do we do that with continuing to invest in technical expertise, which really brings us to the importance of coaching, mentoring, and executive sponsors. So as I mentioned, I had a lot of folks who took that time with me, and they're the ones and that I give full credit to helping me get to where I am today. So given the above CNA example, what would those of us who are more tenured in the business, what are we doing to support this effort? And even for those who are newer to the insurance industry, how can you support some of the reverse mentoring that's going on for those of us who have been in the business longer, and how can we learn something? How can we learn something new? I spend a lot of time with folks in the industry and outside the industry that are just kind of starting out. And I will tell you that I generally learn something new with every conversation with these folks. So I felt that it is important to engage these newer colleagues for solutions in a team environment where all contributions are acknowledged, and because that will help promote an inclusive environment by incorporating those ideas and with what they have to contribute, and trying to do it in a non-condescending way. So I mean, I have been guilty of that sometimes, like, hey, I've been doing this for a long time, and this is just how it's done. Well, that's not always the case, so we need to be open and to embracing that. Some of the best ideas, honestly, that we've implemented come from the fresh look that these newer colleagues bring to the table. We've implemented those processes, and it's worked beautifully. So when we talk about inclusion, Barry mentioned this earlier, how are companies incorporating diversity, equity, inclusion activities to bridge these talent challenges today? So I know we're talking about business processes, but this is something that's front and center for many companies. Just this year alone, the war for talent has escalated to levels I have not seen in several years. I think the hard market is driving part of that. We see, new carrier startups, insurtech companies that are, trying to pull in more experienced talent. And it's challenging because the industry as a whole has not done, honestly, a very good job of training and investing in this talent. So there is, more of a focus in this past year on developing more diverse teams in line with social responsibility initiatives that companies have. So what does that mean in terms of, can they bring more to the table in terms of business processes with what they've been experiencing? So I'm going to include my firm. I work at Aon, and I'm not sure we can say that, sorry Barry, but there are my company and others are investing in promoting apprentice programs or other programs where you're not generally going to a four-year college to start recruiting your talent and developing that talent. There are other avenues for talent and other opportunities to change that, change the complexion and the makeup of your team. So what does this mean for the future? That there will continue to be likely more consolidation. I mentioned my company is hopefully merging with another one sometime soon. But it's my hope that firms continue to invest, not only in the technology tools that are going to make our business models more efficient, but they continue to invest in the technical expertise for their teams. So, Barry, back to you.
Thanks, Shell. Hey, just on a personal note, can you tell us about that? Tell everybody the story about the background behind you.
Thank you, Barry. This May is Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and as Barry well knows, because we've been friends for longer than we both care to admit, I am truly Asian Pacific Islander. I am Chinese Hawaiian. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and the print behind me is a quilt that my grandma, my tutu, made for me many years ago when I was little. And it's framed in koa wood, which is indigenous to Hawaii, and it's something that's very precious to me.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing, and aloha. Janine, you want to talk about the Nordstrom experience and how we fit that into this talent gap that we're all trying to address?
Yes, thanks, Barry. And just to clarify, I retired from Nordstrom a few months ago, so I'm no longer there, but I was there for over 30 years, so I can speak to my experience there and business practices. So, Barry, you mentioned Nordstrom and the culture of customer service, and I really think one of the most important things that we can do is to elevate the human element in all of our business practices, which really will make the work more meaningful. There's a lot of studies that show that younger workers increasingly say they want their jobs to make a positive contribution to society, that millennials want to have a job that they're passionate about, and employees state that their sense of purpose is defined by their work. So when we think about the claims world, injured worker-centric models that elevate the human aspect provide purpose-driven work, an opportunity to really impact people's lives daily and make a difference when they're hurt. And that can really help the bottom line as well. That was the experience I had at Nordstrom. So I really think we have an opportunity to transform our reputation in the industry by re-looking at all our business processes from a human perspective, making the work about helping injured workers recover and less about checking boxes to meet a requirement that may not really be that impactful in an injured worker's recovery. I'll give some examples that, again, a lot of these are things that we've heard and talked about before in our industry. It's just sometimes hard to move forward and make change. One of the first things is making sure that our claim management guidelines, super basic, right? Claim management guidelines, that they incorporate a human element, an element of customer service to support that end goal of helping employees return to work. At Nordstrom, the #1 claim guideline is customer service, helping injured employees recover with an emphasis on communication and sense of urgency for decisions and actions. So examiners are really encouraged to get to know the individual injured worker and help them through to recovery. Everybody's recovery is different. One of the most important elements of this guideline is a very strong emphasis on the first contact with injured workers. And sometimes they think we have so many claims, we just tend to just quickly, oh, I made the contact, I'm done. But I think one of the best ways to ensure an injured worker stays committed to their recovery goal is by building trust and rapport with them as a claims examiner. And that can be a really positive experience, an examiner feeling good about helping someone and building that relationship with an individual. Of course, that requires allowing and expecting examiners have the time for that first quality call, because that's the critical point where they really need to get to know that injured worker as an individual human with different needs and not just a claim number. And of course, that first call obviously allows the examiner to get the information they need to analyze the particular situation for that case and also make decisions around the strategic direction for that claim. One of the overlying principles I think that's super important in a customer service type guideline that leadership can incorporate is the message of using good judgment. Emphasizing this, I think, really allows teams to focus more on what's best for the individual injured worker and allows them to focus on the long-term vision and strategy for the worker's recovery and less on the rules. There's so many rules in workers' compensation. I think we sometimes tend to lose sight of what it might take to get the injured worker back to health and work. And allowing examiners to use that principle of use good judgment and do the right thing for the individual situation really provides a more meaningful work environment for them instead of following a bunch of rules. I also think it's super important that we review what we're measuring in the claims world. I was talking with a senior examiner last week, and he didn't know I was speaking today on this topic, but he just happened to mention that I asked him how he liked his job, and he said, I love the job, but it's way too transaction focused. And I said, well, what do you love about the job? And he said, I love the strategy, the analytics, the critical thinking, the collaboration required to help an injured worker recover. But he said, I spend way too much time on data entry. And he just off the cuff said, and all of my peers feel the same thing, that a lot of the data that I'm asked to track adds no value and takes me away from that strategic part of the job. So I think we can really look at what are our current metrics and are they having unintended consequences? Maybe promoting activities and processes that lead to behavior that doesn't really lead to injured worker recovery and making the job actually tedious for the examiners. So a true cultural shift will require measuring beyond just cost containment and compliance, which tends to be the easiest to measure, and moving toward things that really matter to worker recovery and employee satisfaction. And again, those are harder to measure. Things like speed to decision, authorizing treatment within 24-hour requests instead of just what the state regulations require. How do you measure a good strategic plan, a quality plan to move the case to resolution? How do you measure quality of communications? How do you measure more around claim loads? So we don't just say an examiner has 125 cases. Well, what is in that 125, 150 cases? They're all active return to work cases or really high exposure cases. That's a high caseload, and they can't have that meaningful relationship with the injured worker. I think another thing to consider is, in addition to just measuring the basic metrics, is what about recognizing and rewarding examiners for their customer service wins? Consistently sharing stories, examples of helping injured workers, and maybe not just all the catastrophic type claims, because those are the ones that get a lot of attention. But what about I call them the little sleepers, the ones that the examiner knows, okay, this one is going to be a problem, this one's going to need some extra work, and sharing stories about how the examiner actually helped somebody in a smaller type case. Examiners, I think, can not only learn by hearing those stories, but it also contributes to their sense of purpose in their job. I think, we've talked a lot about this too, is that we need to hire and train for human skills, people that want to help others and be empathetic. At Nordstrom, we actually hired human resource employees into claims jobs and taught them the technical skills. They were excellent examiners. And what was interesting is every time we had an opening, we had a multitude of applicants. It was a coveted position. The reputation was that it was a good job because the program allowed us to help injured workers truly. And then, of course, providing training, not just on the technical side of things, but around human skills. That's obviously pretty critical. I remember started, as Shelly said, a long time ago, I'm in that boat too. And when I started, I was a multi-line adjuster right out of college. And I took the job because I got to go to California for 6 weeks of training, which was fantastic. Great technical training, but I'll never forget. And again, there was no human type skills training. I'll never forget when I came back to Seattle, and of course, piles of big files, paper files, because we didn't have computers back then. But the person sitting next to me was literally swearing and slamming down the phone. And I was so shocked. I couldn't figure out what he was doing. I was like, who are you talking to? And he was talking to customer claimants and injured workers and injured customers. And I was appalled. Of course, that maybe isn't going to happen today, but our practices should really, include more focus on those human type of skills, as well as, training to help prepare examiners for the skills necessary to optimize their injured worker function, the psychosocial skills, evidence-based medicine, and those sort of things. So I really think that business practices that focus on human capital will improve recruitment and retention. And of course, improving business processes requires an investment in technology. Lack of technology is super frustrating for examiners and gets in the way of engaging with the injured worker and minimizes the ability for the examiner to feel purposeful in their work. Injured worker communication tools and prescriptive analytics will generate better outcomes and allow the examiners more time to focus on that human aspect of the claim and just make them feel better about their work. Workflow automation, and implementing tools to make it easier to communicate with injured workers will all just make the job better for our teams. And lastly, I think, we really need to change the way we talk about workers' compensation using simple, positive language. Again, I think there's a lot of conversation about doing this. Some companies have moved the needle on this, but I think this is key. Do our organizations meaningfully emphasize our critical role in society to support injured worker recovery? Do senior leaders in organization use that purpose as a North Star guiding all of our decisions, including the business practices? We provide such an admirable purpose in society in helping injured workers recover, and changing how we talk about it could really help us find employees see this as a meaningful place to work. Bottom line, I really think that relooking at business practices with an eye toward human interactions and again, in the claim scenario, allowing examiners to use good judgment to truly help the injured worker will meet business objectives for every organization in saving money, as well as making claims more meaningful, claims work more meaningful, and perhaps over time shifting the claims work to being a sought after career versus a lot of us falling into it. Barry?
Thanks, Janine. Well done. We'll collect the Q&A for the audience. We'll collect the questions, and for your questions for Janine and Dave and Shelly, we'll do those after everybody's presentation. Dave, you're up.
Well, thanks, Barry. I had some opening comments, and I just have to follow up on something Janine said, because it's an issue I think that underlies all of the concepts that we're talking about here today, whether it's the silver tsunami or changing business processes. I think there's an underlying perception that maybe some of us continue to propagate, that the insurance industry is a terrible place to work, that we can't attract new people, and by the way, we have lousy technology. And I just think we have to get over it ourselves as well. As Janine said, I think this is an amazing industry to work in. If you think about what happens in this country and all over the planet, nothing really occurs in commerce without insurance. You can't buy a car. You can't drive a car. You can't manufacture a shirt. You can't cut a lawn. You can't do anything without insurance. It literally enables commerce to occur. And because at the foundation of all that, I think claims is a very important part of it. When things happen negatively to people and to businesses, we get to step in and do good. We get to make it right. And I think that when you link some of these themes together, people want to come work in the insurance industry. Maybe not because they want to be an insurance professional, but because they want to help people. They want to do good. They want to matter, and they want to work in an environment that has creative technology that enables them to do their job. I think our industry has that in spades now and is really doing a good job in both those areas. You started out with the title of this about reengineering, but the core of that is the silver tsunami. And I just have to take a little bit of issue with that, I guess. I think about tsunamis as this big, huge, single devastating event that can't be stopped. And I know we can't stop the aging workforce, and we can't stop the fact that millennials want and need something different. But I don't think about it as a tsunami as much as I think of it, to stay with the theme of more waves. Because the tsunami suggests there's one set of facts, and if you don't get it as to what this big thing is that's coming at you, it's going to hit you like a brick wall, and you're going to get devastated. I think every wave that comes in, every moment, every change, things start to occur, and there's different needs and wants. I'll give you an example. I think for a long time, when we didn't call it the silver tsunami, we called it the graying workforce. We just assumed that everybody that hit age 62 was gone. They're going to retire. Well, we now know that's not true. For one, 64, turning 65 next month, and still in the seat and going to be for a while. There's a lot of people in the workforce that continue to work well into their 60s and 70s. So the job of sort of figuring out what the tsunami is, what the waves are, might be more considering, like we learned in COVID, of simply re-engineering the job. Maybe we want to keep some of that talent. Maybe those people would rather work at home. Maybe they'd rather work 3 days a week. And a couple of years ago, we might have thought there's no way our job can be done 3 days a week or can be done from home. And we found out today that's absolutely doable. So we have to be a little more flexible in trying to figure out what it is the workforce wants. I think the other thing that maybe the title presumes is that this event is somewhere out in the future. And if you don't get ready for the tsunami now, you're not going to be ready when it hits. Well, I believe it's here now. I believe the waves are hitting today. Let me give you just a couple of statistics from our own organization. Last year in 2020, Sedgwick hired 5,000 new colleagues. To get 5,000 new hires, we had to make job offers to 15,000 people. To make job offers to 15,000 people, we had to do 20,000 interviews. To do 20,000 interviews, we had to receive 35,000 resumes. Well, I don't know how many people you think were out applying for a job in 2020. And by the way, the numbers were down from 2019. So it's even more we expect coming up. But I don't know how many people you think want to come knock on our door, but 35,000 people submitted their resume to just Sedgwick alone, saying they wanted a job in our industry. You add, the Nordstroms and Marshes and Aons and Crawfords and others, hundreds of thousands of people every year want to come work for us. Today at Sedgwick, we're already significantly more diverse than we ever were before. 66% of our population are female, 41% are millennials. This is not something to plan for the future. It's here and now. And 36% of our colleagues are of color. It's not to say that we have that all figured out. It's to suggest that this topic of re-engineering business processes, about thinking about where we're going to get people, what do they want and need, and how do we attract them into our business, is a today issue. And the action item for me, Barry, when you start thinking about this is not something to plan for the future. This is something that if you're not engaged in today, you are missing this wave because it's happening. The re-engineering process is, I think, fascinating. It's maybe the same wave analogy works because it's an ongoing process. There's a saying that I used to really love that came out of the business world, and I tried to figure out whether it was properly attributed to some business theorist or NASA or whatever, but some of you may remember it. It went better, faster, cheaper, pick two, meaning if you wanted something better and faster, it was going to be expensive. If you wanted something cheap and fast, it was not going to be good. Today, I think that in our environment, particularly in our industry, I would change those titles from better, faster, cheaper to technology, people, and process. And re-engineering in our industry today is not picking two of those or one of those. You have to get all three of them right. The interdependencies, I believe, are so significant, particularly when we start thinking about the new generations coming in. Their wants and needs for technology, for example, is not because they want us to have technology that makes us more efficient and more profitable, which is what we started out doing, or technology that makes us better customer service providers, which we want to do. They want it as a core part of, hey, if you can't give me good technology to make my job easier, I'm not going to do it. I'm used to an iPhone or an iPad or an app that gives them instant answers. They want our technology in business to fulfill the same needs that they have in regular life. So technology is no longer sort of an optional standalone think about it. It directly relates to the people. And I think the same thing about processes. That's why I list all three of those. We have to think about how we re-engineer the process to accommodate the new technology to satisfy the new worker. And all of those interdependencies keep changing. As our customer demands raise for increased customer service, we either have to improve the talents of our colleagues or give them better technology to meet that need, or tell the customer no, which I know on this group is not something we do very often. So we have to find lots of ways of using those technologies to modify them to work with the business process. I think that somebody might listen to this and say, well, we better get a plan, right? Let's get a document together, figure out what we're going to do, have technology, people, and processes all work together. I tend to be more of an outcome-oriented person than a plan-oriented person. Mostly because the plans, when you write a plan, the plan can only be designed and can only be prepared if you consider the environment that you're in. And given that I think more so now than ever before in our careers, the environment is changing so fast, you'd have to be exceptionally good in order to come up with a plan that's as resilient today as it's going to be in a month or a year from now. So to me, it's being very focused on the outcome. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Trying to increase the number of millennials in the workforce, increase the job satisfaction, decrease the cost of transaction, increase our investment in technology. Whatever that ultimate objective is, the outcome, I think that's a bigger thing to get focused on than actually today, how are you going to get there? So for me, I encourage people to describe to me not what they want to do, but why do you want to do it? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And then use one of the many capabilities in our firms to get there. I guess the last thing I would say from a timing standpoint, Barry, is that, you know, one of the most common items that all of us have talked about for the last several years is data or artificial intelligence or somehow the use of technology and data to give us the answer. And I think we're at a tipping point of all of that. And I'm here to tell you that at least in the systems that we have and the systems that I see of our competitors, we do have solid data today. The data sets are robust, they are reliable, they are consistent, they are able to answer our questions. The fallout right now is that the human beings aren't ready to trust the data. And I'm hoping that we as an industry are at a tipping point in that if the data actually tells us that we no longer need to do something, I don't know, in the claims world, maybe 3-point contact, something that's tried and true that we've articulated for 50 years. But the reality is 3-point contact is dramatically different today than it ever was in our history. And if the data doesn't support the fact that getting a hold of somebody in 24 hours is going to change the outcome of the claim, let's let the data tell us, don't do that anymore. Reinvest that time, that critical first day, in something else, as Janine said, in a much more customer service, claimant-centric sort of environment. So the third thing I would say is on the tipping point is that start to trust the data, is realize that we do have a robust data set. It can tell us about the human beings that we're hiring, it can tell us about their wants and needs, and it can tell us about the processes that we have with technology and process and human beings, and find new and innovative ways to use those processes to actually make the fact that we do have a need for more people to enter our industry and be more resourceful, we have a way to help them get up to speed and be contributing. That's my initial thoughts. Bear, back to you.
Thanks, Dave. So, Shelly, a question from the audience. I'm going to read it for you and give me your thoughts. The talent gap has been mentioned and competing for the best and the brightest with a goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In competing for the best talent, do you think that teleworking full-time is a benefit that should be offered? And if the answer is yes, what impact does that have with building a company culture and a strong team when you're doing it via video, etc.?
Good question that we're all living right now. You know, first of all, as we've discussed, we're meeting remotely right now. So business can be conducted, but we don't develop the same culture. You know, I think one of the things we're going to be looking at is, you know, people will be allowed to, in my mind, telecommute at least a couple of days a week, right? I don't see that changing. It's worked well. Again, in the war for talent, I think if anybody thinks that, hey, you have to come to the office, 5 days a week. I live in the Bay Area, so you need to take BART from Fremont or wherever every day, and your physical being has to be in the office. You're probably going to lose that person. All right. And particularly, how do you justify saying you have to be in the office? Now, having said that, the culture piece is really going to be challenging. The San Francisco office for us had a pretty strong culture, where the leadership would walk around, visit with people. We had a lot of activities where we would engage with those folks. That's hard to do remotely. One of the things, honestly, it's kind of up to the managers and leaders. Last year when things were completely locked down and people couldn't find toilet paper, they couldn't find hand sanitizer. Some of us would wait in line, get stuff, and we do like drive-bys and drop it off at people's homes and things like that. Those small gestures, while that you can't build culture just around that, the messaging to your employees is that you really care about us personally, and that engages, that elicits more of a dialogue and conversation. So you still can do things remotely. We've learned that this past 14 plus months, but I agree, nothing, this is where my 40 years in the business tells me that I'm an extrovert. I need to see people. The three of you on my screen right now know I'm a big hugger. It's been a rough year for me, not hugging people. But that connection, I need that. And a lot of people do. Even the introverts, honestly, they still want to have some sort of interaction. Even if it's remotely, you can still build a culture around that by staying connected. But part of that culture means making that effort. Okay. And I'm happy to say that most of the folks that I know that are in leadership roles have all made that effort with their teams. They've gone out, they've done drive-bys, celebrations for graduations, babies, weddings, whatever. You still have that connection. You can maintain that connection and help build that culture. Not sure if that answers the question entirely, but hopefully I hit on some of the high points.
Thank you. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think that one of the things that I think we're running a danger right now in business is letting COVID overly influence our decision making. And just an example on that, 2 years ago and prior to that, we were all spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to allow people to work at home, right? We were developing processes and procedures and signing out laptops and everything else. And then we got that all figured out. And then all of a sudden we realized that the generation that we were trying to recruit, the millennials, didn't want to work at home. They wanted a work environment, a home environment at work. They wanted a place to have a social exchange, but they didn't want to sit in the same office and cubicle that my generation did, but they did want to be in that workforce. All of a sudden, COVID hits and we send everybody home, and somehow we have forgotten that there are generational differences. And we're saying, okay, we'll return on July 1st or August 15th, or 20% will always work at home. And I don't think that's going to work. I think we have to remember that different generations have different needs for their work environment. And I'm not sure that most of the workers are going to stay at home. I think a significant, at least the 40% of millennials that we have at Sedgwick, an awful lot of them want to be back in the workplace. They don't want a structured environment of 9 to 5 and sit in a cube, but they want to be back. So I think trying to figure this out, we need to have a significant dose of empathy towards generations and individual differences and, children, no children, commute times and everything else. And cookie cutter answers are going to be difficult.
No, I agree, Dave. We are, our office is opening up to 25% capacity in San Francisco next week. The vast majority of the people that want to come in are the folks between, 22 and 30. All right, they miss each other. They like that social interaction. Now, having said that, you know, depending on what the mask requirement is, what the CDC is saying, I'm not sure they want to be there 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but they want to be there a couple of days a week. And I think, you know, to your point, we need to be thoughtful about our approach. And I think the key is going to be flexibility. So
Janine, another question from the audience. There's much mention these days about claim advocacy philosophies. The benchmarking, the rising benchmarking study has been following that for years. The linkage to that advocacy philosophy and this issue of our potential talent gap that, as Dave rightly put, it's not in the future, it's now. The linkage is how do millennials and other younger in the workforce folks perceive the job that they're doing and their reason for doing it. And it's not only about money, it's not only about savings, it's about doing the right thing in the nice way in a timely fashion. So the question from the audience is, claim advocacy philosophy is great, and it might help in the recruiting and the backfill, if you will, for talent. What does it do to the bottom line? How is it justified on the financial side? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to it from the Nordstrom perspective. So, and again, we had a Nordstrom was self-administered with an advocacy program for the whole time I was there, which was about 30 years. And our results in benchmarking with our peers were always very good. So I strongly believe that it was that consistent program year over year over year of taking care of the injured worker in the way I described, it really did impact the bottom line. I know there's been other studies, if you read about it, so I think others have had the same bottom line results. Not sure if that was through Rising, but there are studies that show that an advocacy approach does make a difference on the bottom line.
Dave, can you speak to that as well? Cedric is very well known for the market segments that you do very well in, and your ability to customize programs for all clients, especially for very large employers. Can you talk about those different philosophical approaches that you put into those programs and what impact it has on the financial results?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with how Janine teed it up. I think, you know, if you approach our industry, the work comp segment of our industry, that your job is to administer a workers' comp regulation, then you're going to get bound up in a lot of, you know, checklists and forms and deadlines. When you remember that the whole reason that workers' compensation exists is because a worker got injured on the job through no fault of their own. And it is all about trying to provide the care to allow them to heal and get back to work. And that caring approach, that ability to be an advocate, I think our evidence is clear that it not only is beneficial to the injured worker, it's beneficial to the employer, to the insurer that has to pay out the money because it reduces the costs. And candidly, it's good for the business of TPAs and people who are administering claims. It is good to take care of people. It is good to close claims sooner because somebody has been returned to work, returned to functionality, not because you denied a claim. And so, I'm trying to avoid using this phrase, caring counts. It's one that we've adopted at Sedgwick. And the reason that we use the words caring counts is exactly what you're asking, Barry. It's caring about the injured worker counts. It does provide a financial benefit by taking care of people properly. And our evidence is clear about that. Actually, the evidence is also clear the other way. If you want to fight all the claims, deny them, get second, opinions on every single treatment, you will run the cost up for everybody in the system.
Shelly, another question from the audience. It's right on point with a discussion that you and I had. You talked about, and for many years have been talking about, the development of new talent, taking newbies and bringing them into our industry. You've talked about the impact that that has on diversity. You also mentioned some very interesting feedback that you have gotten about how people want to be labeled, that they don't want to be labeled a certain generation. Can you talk both about that and then also about the mentoring and the mentee efforts that Aon has made?
Okay, you pack a lot in there, Bear, but I'll try to cover it all. So first, the labels, Gen X, Millennial, Gen Y. It's not that they're offended, but the connotation for some is negative, right? So some have commented to me that, don't bucket me with these people because I don't identify that way. And there's just, a hypersensitivity right now to how people would want to be acknowledged. So I tend to just say, hey, younger colleagues, newer colleagues. Can't even say younger, just say newer, say less experienced. I don't say, I say I've been around for a long time, but I use words like tenured or experienced or things like that, that are a little less, will not attract as much attention, because I have received some of that feedback. Some have said, hey, Shelly, when you bucket us as X, it really sounds a little condescending, that, you're smarter than we are. And, you might be, you've been around longer, but it minimizes what we feel our contribution is. So I've changed my vernacular a little bit to acknowledge that. And then on the mentoring mentee piece, personally, I'm not a huge fan of formal mentoring programs, because I think people kind of connect somewhat naturally. I do a lot of informal coaching, mentoring, with people, throughout the industry, as I mentioned before, because, I was the beneficiary of that myself. But there was a comment on reverse mentoring. I spent a lot of time with folks who are newer to the business, and as I said, I learned a lot. There are things where I just said, hey, look, we're going to work on this massive project. This is how I would approach it. And you'd be amazed at the type of things ideas that come from people. Like, well, that's great, love that, but what if we tried this? Or there's these new methodologies that we're using on this particular project that might be helpful. Things like that, where as I said, I learned something new. Reverse mentoring is not a formal process. I'm having a dinner tonight with one of I just stepped down from being on the risk management advisory board for Temple University's risk management program. And this is a person that I recruited about, 4 or 5 years ago, who's now progressed and is handling some accounts on his own. But, he sees how we, allocate accounts, and he's like, Shelly, maybe you can look at it not just so specifically by dates of business or things like that. Why don't you take a look at it this way? And when we started thinking about it, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. So reverse mentoring and mentoring programs, to me, are something that happen kind of organically. I do it with, anybody who reaches out to me and say, hey, Shelly, you want to grab a cup of coffee or whatever and catch up? I'll take that call. And I will spend time with that individual, because it is something that is, in my mind, mutually beneficial.
So this we're getting down to the very end. Dave, I'm going to throw this out to you. You said something that is makes a lot of sense, and it's a little in conflict with the reason that the transitions exist. The metaphor that I have used regarding the transitions is two things that are very obvious that we've all kind of experienced. I'm sure most of us saw the video of a island resort where happened to be a supermodel who was there. That's why it got so much attention. But we saw images of a family, a mother, a father, and two little kids who were playing on the beach. And they were so excited that the water line was so far back. You could see where the white sand was and where the dark wet sand was. And they were very far out into the wet sand. And it was 20, 30 yards. And of course, they didn't understand how a tsunami works and how big waves come. And unfortunately, they perished because they had no clue what they were experiencing and where they were at that particular moment. And then, you know, the famous scene in the Titanic movie where the very rich people are all dressed in their top hat and their formal wear and the cocktail dresses and the tuxedo, and they're so wealthy that they were able to bring with them two musicians who were there to serenade them, and they're sitting on the main deck of the Titanic, and there's chaos all around them, and they're about to perish because of what happened to the Titanic. So people who were not quite as aware, who really needed to kind of be understanding of the dynamic that's coming at them. And that's why we developed this notion of just create a plan. Even if, now I totally agree, we don't want plans, we want results. However, there are many people who don't get 35,000 applications to hire 5,000 and everything that goes on in between. There are folks who are either in denial or who have been distracted, or they literally maybe don't care. And we wanted to address that full range of spectrum of folks who are not only hyper vigilant about it and have been doing it, as Janine said, for 30 years or for as long as Sedgwick has, to the full range of folks who really maybe aren't doing it at all. Can you speak to those folks?
Sure. I was trying to draw a contrast of the tsunami versus the waves. Not that there's not a tsunami coming. It's that it's not a single event. You can't use this transition series to develop a single plan, put it in the book, go out into the workforce and expect that you're going to hire anybody and everybody you want and get them engaged. Just look at the last year alone. We've already seen that what it takes to get people into the workforce, how much they want to get paid, the work environment that they want, changed dramatically in the United States over the last 14 months because of COVID. And that just happens to be this year's event. There's going to be another event and another event after that. So if we want to say a series of tsunamis, I'm okay with that. But it's that this is an ongoing process. And if I had to leave people with anything, I would say, if you are in the process of dealing with the actively transitioning your workforce, recruiting new generations of people, finding out what they want, need, how to deliver that to your customers, modify your processes to engage them in that in ways that you and I, Barry, maybe didn't get engaged at the time. That's great, but it's not a one and done thing. It's gonna take constant focus and tinkering, and just as Shelly said, categorizing people thinking you have a plan for millennials is only a plan for a single person, because the very next person is going to have a unique set of circumstances. And if you want to hire that person, you better be focused on them, not their age, their ethnicity, their gender. It better be very bespoke to them. So I support I support your analogy.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody. We're at the end of our time for webinar 7, Reimagining Business Processes in the context of our talent gap. Janine Kroll, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Shelly Yen, thank you. Dave, thank you very much. For anybody that wants to see the video again, the webinar, you can go to the Transitions LinkedIn website. And once again, thank you very much, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Barry.